Section 18 of Agatha Webb. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Gabby Cowan. Agatha Webb by Katharine Green. Chapter 18, Part 1. Some leading questions. Fredrick rose early. He had slept but little. The words he had overheard at the end of the lot the night before were still ringing in his ears. Going down the back stairs in his anxiety to avoid Amabel, he came upon one of the stablemen. "Been to the village this morning?" he asked. "No, sir, but Lem has. There is great news there. I wonder if anyone has told Mr. Sutherland." "What news, Jake?" "I don't think my father is up yet." "Why, sir, there were 2 more deaths in town last night. The brothers Abel, and folks to say, Lem heard it a dozen times between the grocery and the fish market, that it was one of these old men who killed Mrs. Webb. The dagger has been found in their house, and most of the money." "Why, sir, what's the matter? Are you sick?" Fredrick made an effort and stood upright. He had nearly fallen. "No, that's it. I am not quite myself. So many horrors, Jake. What did they die of? You say they are both dead?" "Both?" "Yes, sir, and it's dreadful to think of, but it was hunger, sir. Bread came too late. Both men were skeletons to look at. They have kept themselves closed for weeks now, and nobody knew how bad off they were. I don't wonder it upset you, sir. We all feel it a bit, and I just dread to tell Mr. Sutherland." Fredrick staggered away. He had never in his life been so near mental and physical collapse. At the threshold of the sitting-room door he met his father. Mr. Sutherland was looking both troubled and anxious. More so, Fredrick thought, than when he signed the check for him on the previous night. As their eyes met, both showed embarrassment, but Fredrick, whose nerves had been highly strung by what he had just heard, soon controlled himself, and surveying his father with forced calmness, began: "This is dreadful news, sir." But his father, intent on his own thought, hurriedly interrupted him. "You told me yesterday that everything was broken off between you and Miss Page. Yet I saw you re-enter the house together last night, a little while after I gave you the money you asked for." "I know, and it must have had a bad appearance. I entreat you, however, to believe that this meeting between Miss Page and myself was against my wish, and that the relations between us have not been affected by anything that passed between us." "I am glad to hear it, son. You could not do worse by yourself than to return to your old devotion." "I agree with you, sir." And then, because he could not help it, Fredrick inquired if he had heard the news. Mr. Sutherland, evidently startled, asked what news, to which Fredrick replied: "The news about the Zabels. They are both dead, sir. Dead from hunger. Can you imagine it?" This was something so different from what his father had expected to hear that he did not take it in at first. When he did, his surprise and grief were even greater than Fredrick had anticipated. Seeing him so affected, Fredrick, who thought that the whole truth would be no harder to bear than the half, added the suspicion which had been attached to the younger one's name, and then stood back, scarcely daring to be a witness to the outraged feelings which such a communication could not fail to awaken in one of his father's temperament. But though he thus escaped the shocked look which crossed his father's countenance, he could not fail to hear the indignant exclamation which burst from his lips, nor help perceiving that it would take more than the most complete circumstantial evidence to convince his father of the guilt of men he had known and respected for so many years. For some reason Fredrick experienced great relief at this, and was bracing himself to meet the fire of questions which his statement must necessarily call forth, when the sound of approaching steps drew the attention of both towards a party of men coming up the hillside. Among them was Mr. Courtney, prosecuting attorney for the district, and as Mr. Sutherland recognized him, he sprang forward, saying, "There is Courtney. He will explain this." Frederick followed, anxious and bewildered, and soon had the doubtful pleasure of seeing his father enter his study in company with the four men considered to be most interested in the elucidation of the Webb mystery. As he was lingering in an undecided mood in the small passageway leading upstairs, he felt the pressure of a finger on his shoulder. Looking up, he met the eyes of Amabel, who was leaning toward him over the banisters. She was smiling, and though her face was not without evidences of physical languor, there was a charm about her person which would have been sufficiently enthralling to him 24 hours before, but which now caused him such a physical repulsion that he started back in the effort to rid his shoulder from her disturbing touch. She frowned. It was an instantaneous expression of displeasure which was soon lost in one of her gurgling laughs. "Is my touch so burdensome?" she demanded. "If the pressure of one finger is so unbearable to your sensitive nerves, how will you relish the weight of my whole hand?" There was a fierceness in her tone, a purpose in her look, that for the first time in his struggle with her revealed the full depth of her dark nature. Shrinking from her appalled, he put up his hand in protest, at which she changed again in a twinkling, and with a cautious gesture toward the room into which Mr. Sutherland and his friends had disappeared, she whispered significantly, "We may not have another chance to confer together. Understand, then, that it will not be necessary for you to tell me, in so many words, that you are ready to link your fortunes to mine. The taking off of the ring you wear, and your slow putting of it on again, in my presence, will be understood by me as a token that you have reconsidered your present attitude and desire my silence and myself." Frederick could not repress a shudder. For an instant he was tempted to succumb on the spot and have the long agony over. Then his horror of the woman rose to such a pitch that he uttered an execration, and turning away from her face, which was rapidly growing loathsome to him, he ran out of the passageway into the garden, seeing as he ran a persistent vision of himself pulling off the ring and putting it back again, under the spell of a look he rebelled against even while he yielded to his influence. "I will not wear a ring. I will not subject myself to the possibility of obeying her behest under a sudden stress of fear or fascination," he exclaimed, pausing by the well curb and looking over it at his reflection in the water beneath. "If I drop it here, I at least lose the horror of doing what she suggests under some involuntary impulse." But the thought that the mere absence of the ring from his finger would not stand in the way of his going through the motions to which she had just given such significance deterred him from the sacrifice of a valuable family jewel, and he left the spot with an air of frenzy such as a man displays when he feels himself on the verge of a doom he can neither meet nor avert. As he re-entered the house, he felt himself enveloped in the atmosphere of a coming crisis. He could hear voices in the upper hall, and amongst them he caught the accents of her he had learned so lately to fear. Impelled by something deeper than curiosity and more potent even than dread, he hastened toward the stairs. When half way up, he caught sight of Amabel. She was leaning back against the balustrade that ran across the upper hall, with her hands gripping the rail on either side of her and her face turned toward the 5 men who had evidently issued from Mr. Sutherland's study to interview her. As her back was to Frederick, he could not judge of the expression of that face save the effect it had upon the different men confronting her. But to see them was enough. From their looks he could perceive that this young girl was in one of her baffling moods, and that from his father down not one of the men present knew what to make of her. At the sound his feet made, a relaxation took place in her body, and she lost something of the defiant attitude she had before maintained. Presently he heard her voice. "I am willing to answer any questions you may choose to put to me here, but I cannot consent to shut myself in with you in that small study. I should suffocate." Frederick could perceive the looks which passed between the 5 men assembled before her, and was astonished to note that the insignificant fellow they called Sweetwater was the first to answer. "Very well," said he. "If you enjoy the publicity of the open hall, no one here will object. Is not that so, gentlemen?" Her 2 little fingers, which were turned towards Frederick, ran up and down the rail, making a peculiar rasping noise, which for a moment was the only sound to be heard. Then Mr. Courtney said: "How came you have to the handling of the money taken from Agatha Webb's private drawer?" It was a startling question, but it seemed to affect Amabel less than it did Frederick. It made him start, but she only turned her head a trifle aside, so that the peculiar smile with which she prepared to answer could be seen by anyone standing below. "Suppose you ask something less leading than that, to begin with," she suggested in her high, unmusical voice. "From the searching nature of this inquiry, you evidently believe I have information of an important character to give you concerning Mrs. Webb's unhappy death. Ask me about that. The other question I will answer later." The aplomb with which this was said, mixed as it was with a feminine allurement of more than ordinary subtlety, made Mr. Sutherland frown and Dr. Talbot look perplexed. But it did not embarrass Mr. Courtney, who made haste to respond in his driest accents: "Very well. I am not particular as to what you answer first. A flower worn by you at the dance was found near Batsy's skirts before she was lifted off that morning. Can you explain this, or rather, will you?" "You are not obliged to, you know," put in Mr. Sutherland, with his inexorable sense of justice. "Still, if you would, it might rob these gentlemen of suspicions you certainly cannot wish them to entertain." "What I say," she remarked slowly, "will be as true to the facts as if I stood here on my oath. I can explain how a flower from my hair came to be in Mrs. Webb's house, but not how it came to be found under Batsy's feet. That someone else must clear up." Her little finger, lifted from the rail, pointed toward Frederick, but no one saw this, unless it was that gentleman himself. "I wore a purple orchid in my hair that night, and there would be nothing strange in its being afterward picked up in Mrs. Webb's house, because I was in that house at or near the time she was murdered." "You in that house?" "Yes, as far as the ground floor, no farther." Here the little finger stopped pointing. "I am ready to tell you about it, sirs, and only regret I have delayed doing so so long. But I wish to be sure it was necessary. Your presence here and your first question show that it is." There was suavity in her tone now, not unmixed with candor. Sweetwater did not seem to relish this, for he moved uneasily and lost a shade of his self-satisfied attitude. He had still to be made acquainted with all the ins and outs of this woman's remarkable nature. "We are waiting," suggested Dr. Talbot. She turned to face this new speaker, and Frederick was relieved from the sight of her tantalizing smile. "I will tell my story simply," said she, "with the simple suggestion that you believe me, otherwise you will make a mistake. While I was resting from a dance the other night, I heard two of the young people talking about the Zabels. One of them was laughing at the old men, and the other was trying to relate some half forgotten story of early love which had been the cause, she thought, of their strange and melancholy lives. I was listening to them, but I did not take in much of what they were saying till I heard behind me an irascible voice exclaiming, 'You laugh, do you? I wonder if you would laugh so easily if you knew that these two poor old men haven't had a decent meal in a fortnight.' I didn't know the speaker, but I was thrilled by his words. Not had a good meal, these men, for a fortnight? I felt as if personally guilty of their suffering, and happening to raise my eyes at this minute, and seeing through an open door the bountiful refreshments prepared for us in the supper room, I felt guiltier than ever. Suddenly I took a resolution. It was a queer one, and may serve to show you some of the oddities of my nature. Though I was engaged for the next dance, and though I was dressed in the flimsy garments suitable for the occasion, I decided to leave the ball and carry some sandwiches down to these old men. Procuring a bit of paper, I made up a bundle and stole out of the house without having said a word to anybody of my intention. Not wishing to be seen, I went out by the garden door, which is at the end of the dark hall. Just as the band was playing the Harebell mazurka, interpolated Sweetwater. Startled for the first time from her careless composure by an interruption of which it was impossible for her at that time to measure either the motive or the meaning, she ceased to play with her fingers on the baluster rail and let her eyes rest for a moment on the man who had thus spoken, as if she hesitated between her desire to annihilate him for his impertinence and a fear of the cold hate she saw actuating his every word and look. Then she went on as if no one had spoken. I ran down the hill recklessly. I was bent on my errand and not at all afraid of the dark. When I reached that part of the road where the streets branch off, I heard footsteps in front of me. I had overtaken someone. Slackening my pace so that I should not pass this person whom I instinctively knew to be a man, I followed him till I came to a high board fence. It was that surrounding Agatha Webb's house, and when I saw it I could not help connecting the rather stealthy gait of the man in front of me with a story I had lately heard of the large sum of money she was known to keep in her house. Whether this was before or after this person disappeared round the corner I cannot say, but no sooner had I become certain that he was bent upon entering this house than my impulse to follow him became greater than my precaution, and turning aside from the direct path to the Zabels, I hurried down High Street just in time to see the man enter Mrs. Webb's front gateway. It was a late hour for visiting, but as the house had lights in both its lower and upper stories, I should by good rights have taken it for granted that he was an expected guest and gone on my way to the Zabels. But I did not. The softness with which this person stepped, and the skulking way in which he hesitated at the front gate, aroused my worst fears, and after he had opened that gate and slid in, I was so pursued by the idea that he was there for no good that I stepped inside the gate myself and took my stand in the deep shadow cast by the old pear tree, on the right-hand side of the walk. Did anyone speak? There was an unanimous denial from the 5 gentlemen before her, yet she did not look satisfied. "I thought I heard someone make a remark," she repeated, and paused again for half a minute, during which her smile was a study. It was so cold and in such startling contrast to the vivid glances she threw everywhere except behind her on the landing, where Fredrick stood listening to her every word. "We are very much interested," remarked Mr. Courtney. "Pray go on." Drawing her left hand from the balustrade where it had rested, she looked at one of her fingers with an odd backward gesture. "I will," she said, and her tone was hard and threatening. "5 minutes no longer passed when I was startled by a loud and terrible cry from the house, and looking up at the second-story window from which the sound proceeded, I saw a woman's figure hanging out in a seemingly pulseless condition. Too terrified to move, I clung trembling to the tree, hearing and not hearing the shouts and laughter of a dozen or more men who at that minute passed by the corner on their way to the wharves. I was dazed, I was choking, and only came to myself when sooner or later, I do not know how soon or how late, a fresh horror happened. The woman whom I had just seen fall almost from the window was a serving woman, but when I heard another scream I knew that the mistress of the house was being attacked, and riveting my eyes on those windows, I beheld the shade of one of them thrown back and a hand appear, flinging out something which fell in the grass on the opposite side of the lawn. Then the shade fell again, and hearing nothing further, I ran to where the object flung out had fallen, and feeling for it found and picked up an old-fashioned dagger, dripping with blood. Horrified beyond all expression, I dropped the weapon and retreated into my former place of concealment. But I was not satisfied to remain there. A curiosity, a determination even to see the man who had committed this dastardly deed, attacked me with such force that I was induced to leave my hiding place and even to enter the house, where in all probability he was counting the gains he had just obtained at the price of so much precious blood. The door, which he had not perfectly closed behind him, seemed to invite me in, and before I had realized my own temerity, I was standing in the hall of this ill-fated house. The interest which up to this moment had been breathless now expressed itself in hurried ejaculations and broken words, and Mr. Sutherland, who had listened like one in a dream, exclaimed eagerly, and in a tone which proved that he, for the moment at least, believed this more than improbable tale: "Then you can tell us if Philemon was in the little room at the moment when you entered the house?" As everyone there present realized the importance of this question, a general movement took place, and each and all drew nearer as she met their eyes and answered placidly: "Yes, Mr. Webb was sitting in a chair asleep. He was the only person I saw." "Oh, I know he never committed this crime," gasped his old friend, in a relief so great that one and all seemed to share it. "Now I have courage for the rest. Go on, Miss Page." But Miss Page paused again to look at her finger, and give that sideway toss to her head that seemed so uncalled for by the situation to any who did not know of the compact between herself and the listening man below. "I hate to go back to that moment," said she, "for when I saw the candles burning on the table, and the husband of the woman who at that very instant was possibly breathing her last breath in the room overhead, sitting there in unconscious apathy, I felt something rise in my throat that made me deathly sick for a moment. Then I went right in where he was and was about to shake his arm and wake him, when I detected a spot of blood on my finger from the dagger I had handled. That gave me another turn and led me to wipe off my finger on his sleeve. "It's a pity you did not wipe off your slippers too," murmured Sweetwater. Again she looked at him. Again her eyes opened in terror upon the face of this man, once so plain and insignificant in her eyes, but now so filled with menace she inwardly quaked before it, for all her apparent scorn. "Slippers," she murmured. "Did not your feet as well as your hands pass through the blood on the grass?" She disdained to answer him. "I have accounted for the blood on my hand," she said, not looking at him but at Mr. Courtney. "If there is any on my slippers it can be accounted for in the same way." And she rapidly resumed her narrative. "I had no sooner made my little finger clean I never thought of anyone suspecting the old gentleman when I heard steps on the stairs, and knew that the murderer was coming down, and in another instant would pass the open door before which I stood. Though I had been courageous enough up to that minute, I was seized by a sudden panic at the prospect of meeting face to face one whose hands were perhaps dripping with the blood of his victim. To confront him there and then might mean death to me, and I did not want to die, but to live, for I am young, sirs, and not without a prospect of happiness before me. So I sprang back, and seeing no other place of concealment in the whole bare room, crouched down in the shadow of the man you call Philemon. For 1-2 minutes I knelt there in a state of mortal terror, while the feet descended, paused, started to enter the room where I was, hesitated, turned, and finally left the house." "Miss Page, wait, put in the coroner. "You saw him. You can tell who this man was?" The eagerness of this appeal seemed to excite her. A slight color appeared in her cheeks, and she took a step forward, but before the words for which they so anxiously waited could leave her lips, she gave a start and drew back with an ejaculation which left a more or less sinister echo in the ears of all who heard it. Fredrick had just shown himself at the top of the staircase. End of chapter 18, part 1 of Some Leading Questions. Recorded by Gabby Cowan.